Hey, what's up everyone? Today I am going to be talking about aspects in relation to one's chart. So this would probably be something for maybe more advanced astrology students, but you don't have to be an advanced astrology student to want to learn about what an aspect is, how it operates in your chart. So I'm just going to break down some of the most important aspects. I'm not going to get into all of the other aspects. I'm just going to do the main 4 aspects. These are the ones that in my birth chart readings I look at because, in one's chart, often there can be so many aspects that to delineate all of the other small ones along with the large one can kind of make things more confusing than they ought to be, especially when you're analyzing a chart for the first time. I want to create my charts in a way that people can understand them a little bit better. But the thing about aspects is that a lot of times they can sort of contradict one another or potentially cancel one another out. But I'm going to be looking at the 4 main aspects: conjunctions, trines, squares, and oppositions. First, let me just explain generally what an aspect is. If you look at your birth chart, most of the time, unless you have a very rare chart, you have things all over the place through the zodiac. So you could have a planet in Aries, a planet in Leo, a planet in Aquarius, and this is all what makes you unique. But sometimes these planets are going to form angles. And remember that this greatly depends on the degree that the planet is in of that sign. So each sign has 30 degrees. So from the beginning of Aries to the end of Aries, there's 30 degrees, and that is true for every sign, no matter what. And the planets move through these degrees at different paces. So the planets that are closer to the sun and closer to Earth are going to move at a faster speed. Like the planet or celestial body that moves the fastest in our chart is the moon, because it is the closest to Earth. So the moon moves very fast. The sun and Mercury move around the same. Mercury's sometimes a little bit faster than Venus and Mars and so on. So the planet that takes the longest to transit through a sign is Pluto, which is the most farthest away. So, as the year goes on, all of these fast-moving planets move at a quicker speed to where they can form all types of angles to the other planets. And sometimes they can be close together, the planets, sometimes they can be far apart, and all of those formations that the planets form are going to create aspects sometimes. So like I said, the degrees are important to look at, because you could have, for example, you may think you have a trine in your chart because you have a planet in Aries and a planet in Leo. And I'm going to get into what trines mean, but just as an example, you may think you have that aspect just by looking at the signs, but you could have Aries at the beginning, say 3 degrees, and Mars in Leo at 20 degrees. They will not form an aspect at that point. It's also important to look at degrees for the orb. The orb is the extent to which that aspect is exact. A 0 and a 0 degree planet are going to be an exact aspect, but a 0 and a 5 degree planet are still going to form an aspect. I usually use an orb of 6 to 7 degrees. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a conjunction. It's probably one of the strongest aspects that is possible, because it is when 2 planets are right next to each other. So say the sun is moving through Aries, and at the time Mars is also in Aries. Say Mars is at about 20 degrees Aries. The sun, since it moves faster than Mars, it is going to catch up with Mars at some point down the road. So when 2 planets are in the same sign at the same degree, that is a conjunction. Now, in your chart, you can also consider a conjunction to be anything. I would say 6 degrees is like a loose conjunction. So anything from 0 to 6 degrees. So perhaps you were born during that time when the sun was approaching Mars, but Mars is at 23 and the sun is at 20, that would still be considered a conjunction. This can apply with any planet. Sometimes you can have multiple conjunctions. I'm talking about the aspect that's formed between two planets because it's always going to be two planets, two planets, two planets. But of course, there can also be, multiple planets. So for example, when I was born in 1990, people who are born during, who are Capricorns, born under the sun of Capricorn, at the time, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune were all in Capricorn, as well as, in my case, Mercury and Venus. Now, I don't have all of those things in conjunction, but some people do. So a lot of people that were born in the late 80s, early 90s, that have a lot of Capricorn planets usually have conjunctions. So for example, when I was born, Uranus was in Capricorn at 6 degrees, and Neptune was in Capricorn at 12 degrees, so that's a loose conjunction. But then Mercury, which was passing through Capricorn, landed at 9 degrees on the day that I was born. So it was right in between Uranus and Neptune. So therefore, my Mercury has a conjunction with both Uranus and Neptune. So what a conjunction means is basically that both planets in question are so close together to where when one planet is acting, the other planet is also acting. So you can't really separate them. So the energy of the sign that those planets are in is also amplified and intensified. I'm not going to get into like all the aspects and what they mean. Maybe I'll save that for another video. But you want to look at each planet, what it represents. So for example, Mercury is a planet of rationality, thought processes, communication, stuff like that. So if it's next to Neptune, which is a planet of dreams, fantasies, delusions, addiction, stuff like that, you're going to blend the traits of Mercury and blend the traits of Neptune to where they can't really separate each other. So a lot of times people with Mercury and Neptune conjunct are big dreamers, big imagination, often very intuitive, because you're blending rational thought with Neptune topics. If you have a conjunction, you want to look at the energy of both planet and the energy of the sign as well, and put them all together to where you can't separate what's happening. So a lot of people with a lot of conjunctions in their chart have a very strong personality, very true to whatever the sign of that conjunction is, but it can be sort of limiting in the way that neither planet really learns from each other because they're like conjoined twins, basically. The next aspect I'm going to talk about is a trine. So a trine is like a triangle. No, that wasn't an Illuminati symbol. That is just a triangle, okay? So a trine is a triangle, and it's when often, traditionally, it would be the signs of the same element. So Aries, Leo, Sagittarius. But depending on degrees, sometimes the actual element or the sign can vary. But let's just try to keep it simple. It would be the same element. So a trine is known for being a positive aspect. It is a very positive aspect because the energy of a trine is very harmonious. They work well together. There's a lot of similar traits. So for example, if you have Venus in Taurus and Mars in Capricorn, your Venus expression and your Mars expression are going to be really harmonious together. So you probably have positive relationships, etc., etc. Also depends on other aspects, which I'll get to later. But the trine energy is just sort of a natural talent, natural gift, natural harmoniousness. Now, the one downside with the trine is that sometimes it can, that harmonious nature can sort of prevent you from growing because you were sort of born with this natural niceness to where getting to the next level isn't always on your to-do list because, you kind of got everything worked out. It's kind of like the energy of a trine is sort of someone who was born into really positive circumstances, wealth, etc., but never had to push themselves to, be wealthy. or to just do anything in life that was more challenging because they already had it all set up. But generally, a trine is a good thing. It kind of gives you a little bit of a boost, confidence, etc. Those two planets work well together, so you don't always have to worry about them. But it's not as strong of an aspect. Then we have the two more challenging aspects. First, we have the square, okay? Square. So these planets are going to form 90 degree angles with each other. So this is going to be all of the signs typically that are in the same modality, but not the polarity. So for example, that Taurus would be square with Leo and Aquarius. Leo would be squared with Taurus and Scorpio. Scorpio would be squared with Leo and Aquarius would be squared with Taurus and Scorpio. A square is basically butting heads. It doesn't get along naturally. There's tension. It's sort of like when you meet a right angle, it's sharp, but it can also be very generative as far as energy goes. But a lot of times, the hardest part about a square is that you're kind of trying to reconcile two different parts of yourself that don't get along. So the energy of Aries and the energy of Cancer are very different, to where someone who has an Aries moon and a Cancer sun might be sort of at war with themselves, because there's just this constant sort of battle and this sort of aggression and tension. But the positive thing about a square is that it also allows you room for growth, because you have to get over something. You have to push through something. You're getting that opposition, and so you have to really try harder. Therefore, you will likely end up being a very dynamic person. A lot of times people with squares in their chart are very dynamic people, but they can also be very conflicted people. They can be the kind of people that have a lot of drama or conflict in their lives, or are just more complex people that are harder to deal with in some ways. This is also going to play into which houses these planets are in. That's another topic as well. It's something with my charts I do as a whole at the end of my chart. You can find everything on my website, by the way. I blend all these things together, look at the houses, look at the signs, look at the aspects. So that's something you'd have to have an astrologer do. It's not something I could ever really share in a video because it's too complex. But I'm just talking about the general energies of these aspects. So the energy with the square, the two planets are just not getting along. They have like different agendas, you know what I mean? One's going this way and one's going that way, and they're sort of trying to reconcile something, but it's naturally more difficult. Like I said, people with squares are often the most dynamic people. People who've had challenging lives and challenges to face in their life are often the most awesome. In comparison to what I talked about at the trine, somebody being born into good circumstances, kind of being lazy, never really having to push hard, versus someone who has a lot of squares, it's like someone being born into very adverse situations. And by the way, a lot of times this is actually the case as far as what you're born into. Sometimes people with a lot of trines are born into very harmonious situations, and sometimes people born with squares are born into negative situations, especially if topics of the home and family are involved in this chart reading. That's a side note. Yeah, it's basically like someone who's born into really difficult circumstances and have to overcome it, and they're constantly meeting resistance, but they get to a more strong, interesting, dynamic place in their life. You know, there's good things about all aspects, I would say. And what I've learned is that it's better to have bad aspects or challenging aspects than no aspects, because the planet in question is being triggered, and when a planet is being triggered and highlighted, it gives you more of an understanding of that planet, and that planet has a more active role in your life. Whereas if that planet has no aspects, sometimes it just kind of gets left in the dust and forgotten about. So for example, if like me, I don't have any aspects to my Mars, so sometimes my vital physical energy is lacking. So for example, like whatever the planet in your chart that doesn't have any aspects kind of needs the most attention, because it's naturally not paid attention to. Aspect I'm going to talk about is an opposition. So an opposition would be the polarity signs, traditionally, naturally. Gemini, Sagittarius, Cancer, Capricorn, etc. So an opposition is 180-degree angle. So it's on each side of the chart. So that oppositional energy is difficult and similar to a square in that there's a challenge, but the difference with the opposition is that it's sort of like two sides of something. It's not meeting at a harsh intersection. It's one person over here, one person over there, but if you join them together, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. So there's going to be a lot of similarities, but a lot of oppositional traits as well. So you kind of have to work, it's sort of like a seesaw. You have to balance the traits. There's always something connected with the relational quality of this aspect. So for example, if Venus is in opposition to Pluto, you're going to have to balance the Pluto energy with the Venus energy, because sometimes it can lean too far into Pluto or lean too far into Venus. In a more traditional sense, the Sun and the Moon opposition, which is one of the strongest aspects, second to conjunction of Sun and Moon. The Sun and Moon opposition, you're going to either be too much your Sun or too much your Moon, too ego-driven or too emotional-driven. So your challenge in life is to find a balance for these things. And a lot of time people with oppositions can also have their relationships is a big topic for them, because you're mirroring yourself in another human being. So you can sort of find a balance through someone else, but not want to put everything too much on someone else. The goal is to get to a balance point with the oppositions. That's what I have on aspects today. Like I said, everything blends together in your chart. You can have conjunctions, squares, trines, oppositions. A lot of times people have all of them. And so some things can cancel each other out. Some things can add dimension. You know, in life, a lot of times we can't just say I'm this and I'm that. A lot of times I'm this, but I'm also that, which changes this, and then this feels like that, but then this is also coming from that, and that. There's a lot to it, and that's why you have to have someone look at your chart. But in general, if you want to just sort of try to understand aspects more, look at the planets in question, look at the traits of those planets, then look at the overall energy of the aspect that they're forming, then look at the houses that they're in, and look at the signs that they're in, and try to blend it all together to understand where that energy might be manifesting. I would love to help you figure out your aspects. You can check out my website, which is capaquarius.com. I have all types of charts and readings. I also offer video readings. Other than that, I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for watching.